Good afternoon, everyone. I am so happy to welcome you to the CSUSB libraries for our wonderful event, and we have our student here who's going to introduce our speaker, Chantal Brown. She is a CSUSB graduate in the English program, and also a current master's student in writing and a student advisor in the Office of Black Student Success. So warm welcome to our CSUSB student introducer. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to all. I will begin with the acknowledgement of those who made this special program possible. Please hold your applause until the end of the acknowledgements. Firstly, a warm thank you to Dean Rebecca Lubas, who, without hesitation, supported the idea for this event when it was first proposed. Secondly, a very warm thank you to the Black Faculty, Staff, and Student Association. A deep appreciation for the Women's History Planning Committee and an expression of gratitude to the Faculty Center for Excellence and Tin Lee for technical support. And a very special thank you to Dr. Brandon Gamble, the Director of the Office for Black Student Success, and Mr. Ravi Mangro. And our audience here and online, we thank you. We will hear from two impactful women, and both are at the forefront of their respective fields. Our keynote speaker is influential in her own right. Excuse me, I read that. Francisca Afua Opoku-Boateng is an assistant professor in cybersecurity at California State University, San Bernardino. She holds a Master's of Science and Doctor of Philosophy in Cyber Defense from Dakota State University, South Dakota. She also holds a Master of Science in Computer Science and Information Systems from the University of Michigan. Prior to joining CSUSB, she served as Senior Cybersecurity Consultant specializing in cyber threat intelligence, vulnerability management, and operational technology. Opoku-Boateng's extensive research portfolio encompasses areas such as Black girls in cyber, dark web, cyber forensics, open source intelligence, investigations, cyber threat awareness, education and intelligence, privacy, and artificial intelligence, or IA. She is a current New America hashtag Drop the Mic Cyber Fellow, where she combines her passion for OSINT with her expertise in cyber forensics investigation to examine the intersection between AI, OSINT, and cyber investigations, particularly in relation to individuals' privacy considerations. Opoku-Boateng's research aims to provide a framework that will provide valuable insights into the ethical utilizations of OSINT. Investigations while it addresses impact on individuals' right to privacy and contributions to the education of investigators in this rapidly evolving field. Dr. Opoku-Boateng actively contributes to underrepresented communities, including mentorship, ambassadorship, participation as a speaker, and presenter at numerous events. She also serves as a committee and board member, highlighting her dedication to fostering inclusivity and diversity. Folks, please give a hearty welcome to Dr. Francisca.
All right. Thank you, everyone, and welcome once again to today's session or today's event. We're so excited that you took time out of your busy schedules to be here. Before we begin, Dr. Nicole or Donna, if I may, I just want to, express my gratitude to Robbie and the team for having me have this conversation with you as we dive deeper into the book that you wrote. But before we go ahead and do that, I also want to give a shout out to my students who actually gave me, the permission to take our class session to actually do this. And for that reason, they are here. So I want us all to give them a round of applause for being here and listening. Thank you so much. I appreciate you all. Right. So, I just want you to briefly tell us a little bit about yourself because, of course, with this book and with the conversation we're going to have, it's going to open up, the various things that has influenced you in ultimately writing this book. But if you could share with us, a little bit about yourself so we have an idea of who we are having the honor to be having this conversation with today, that would be great.
All right, thank you. Thank you all for being here. My name is Dr. Donna Nicol. I am currently the Associate Dean of Personnel and Curriculum and a Professor of History at Cal State Long Beach. I am a CSU product. I have a bachelor's degree in History and African American Studies from Cal State Fullerton, a master's degree, in History, U.S. History from Cal State Long Beach. I have a master's degree, a second master's degree in Higher Ed Administration from Ohio State University, and my PhD is in Educational Studies with an emphasis in history of higher education. I have been in 3 CSUs for my career. First at Cal State Fullerton for 10 years. I was the first non-white person to be granted promotion and tenure in women and gender studies. At Cal State Dominguez Hills, I was the chair and the first woman to ever be promoted to full professor. And now I am at Cal State Long Beach, where I am the first Black person in senior leadership in the College of Liberal Arts, which is a massive college that has over 10,000 students in that college alone. I am a historian by training. I am a 3rd generation history major. My grandmother studied Chinese history. My mother studied Latin American history. So history is kind of in my blood. I've always been interested in higher education, in particular, how underrepresented groups kind of navigate through higher education. And so I was an activist on campus as an undergrad, and this has actually taken me to this point. If you go through the book, you will realize I have a kinship to this woman who's the subject of the book because she paved the way for me to be able to get my education. Sorry. I have such a loud voice that sometimes I forget I need a mic. But she really made it possible for a lot of underrepresented students, low-income students, to be able to get a college education. And when I discovered her, I kind of discovered her by kind of happenstance. And I knew I needed to write something about her to kind of memorialize the kind of work that she did. So I've been a faculty member. I am now an administrator. I see my administrative role as trying to get rid of red tape so that students can get their education and so that faculty can be supported. So I am very delighted to be here to be able to have this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And you know what? Let's give a round of applause to Dr. Nicol. So for those of you here, thank you very much. So for those of you here, just to give you a brief, background of Dr. Nicol's book, as I read through the book, really she wrote a very impactful book, and this book revolved around another amazing woman, Dr. Claudia Hampton. And here, Dr. Claudia Hampton, just to give you a brief idea of who she was, is she's the first Black woman trustee when it comes to the CSU system. She was appointed as far back as 1974 by Governor Ronald Reagan. And she served on the CSU board. And so paving way for Black women to get a seat at the table or minority women to get a seat at the table. And she also was the first female chair. And this book really, Nicole, you did highlight, I'm sorry, Donna, or Dr. Nicole, you did highlight, the staunch advocacy that Dr. Hampton did and how she went above and beyond, a reason why today amazing, individuals or women like you have a seat at the table and still continuing with the good work that she did, just to make sure that, like you said, or to borrow your words, the red tapes are taken away so that, underrepresented or minorities can also have a seat at the table. And so we're going to dive into her book. I would be, highlighting a couple of things that stood out to me so she can share more light on it. And I hope that as you listen, this would inspire you. This would give you the opportunity to also create opportunities and tables for people or bring people on board. That way they can also contribute. So let me go ahead and start. And I took some notes because, of course, there was amazing things in there and I can't really remember everything, right? So the first thing that came to mind was how you did highlight Dr. Hampton's, use of sly civility and just understanding how she was able to leverage that strategic blend of assertiveness and boldness when it came to whatever she was doing in order to play that specific role or navigate and influence like a space that was predominantly dominated by white males, right? And so this approach is something that till date is being very clear and it's being, out there. But I guess my first question for you would be, or my first comments that I want you to speak to would be, when I read the book, I realized how Dr. Hampton was able to influence decision despite, the barriers or the roadblocks that were there. And you captured that very clearly, of course, with the space she found herself in with the predominantly, white males. A reason why you term it as the sly civility she used or she leveraged. But can you speak more about that approach and help me or help everyone here just understand in very basic terms what we meant by that? What made you even term that as the sly civility, or speak more about how she could navigate that?
Yeah, so in the 1970s, well, in the later 60s and into the 70s, you have kind of two basic approaches to civil rights. You have, like kind of the Martin Luther King gradual approach, more pragmatic. And then you have more of an kind of idealist approach that would also incorporate like Black radicalism, not, speaking truth to power directly. And so Hampton, realizing that she's on this all-white male board and she needs to get things done. Ideally, of course, we would like for everyone to come into the university and have the same access to financial aid and to be treated as if everyone, is more or less the same capability and competence. But Hampton understood that there was so much hesitation or resistance to the gains of the civil rights movement and the gains of the Black Power movement that a lot of the men on the board just did not want to change and did not want to incorporate new groups of people into the Cal State system. We have a mythology in California that we are very diverse. We're diverse on some coast, but if you go to the interior of the state, we don't always see that. And then we also, even on those coasts, still have, incidents of, race riots and so forth. So in order to navigate on this all-white male board, Hampton had to come up with a strategy. And that strategy, I term it as sly civility. It is not my term. It is a term by an Indian cultural theorist named Homi Bhabha. And what he's talking about is when colonized people are trying to make advances to help their community, how can they resist the imposition of a colonizer? The way to do that, there's three ways, he says. You can mimic the colonizer and act just like them. you can become a hybrid of the colonizer and keep some of your home culture and take some of the colonizer culture. In this case, he's talking about colonial India. Or there's a third way called sly civility. What sly civility means is that you behave civilly toward the colonizer, gain their knowledge, gain their access to their resources, and then you slyly pass it on to other people in your community who are disenfranchised. And so I was raised in the Black radical tradition. When I first encountered Claudia Hampton and some of the things that she did to kind of become this sly civility practitioner, I was like, nope, this is antithetical to my politics. My politics is to tell people how I feel and tell them that they're wrong and that this is the way they need to make things right. But Claudia Hampton taught me that sometimes you got to pull back, and to be more effective, you have to be sly and civil in order to be more effective. So let me give you an example of what she did for sly civility. Hampton did not know anybody when she was appointed to the board. She was appointed by Ronald Reagan, which was fascinating in and of itself. If you know anything about his politics, the last thing you would think, he would appoint a Black woman to anything. Sure. But he appointed her as a favor to someone else. And when she got to the board, she was kind of isolated. There were only 2 or 3 other women before her. All of the men were wealthy, white conservative men. And she's like, I got to figure out a way to be effective. How am I going to be effective with these men? And she realized there were periods, months at a time, when she wouldn't hear anything from the board. And that was the time when the informal telephone network was happening. Everybody was making these backdoor deals, but she was not included in the conversation. And so she said, I got to make a seat at the table for myself. I'm going to cook dinner for these men. And like when I first heard that, I was like, nope. I'm not doing it. I'm cooking dinner for them? Okay. But she cooked dinner for these men and invited them to her house. And so they got to know her in this kind of informal way. And so she started to barter and make deals with them through this being a hostess. And so she used that personal relationship building in order to get funding for affirmative action when there were times when the budget was so bad, it was like affirmative action would be the only thing that would get funded. And it was because Claudia Hampton, they considered her to be their trustee, like she was like their like dorm mom kind of thing. And so she had no hesitation to go have beers with the guys, go have cigarettes with them, hang out, informally in order to show them that she was safe. It was a way for her to say, don't focus on my race. It was almost as if she was saying, I'm going to play to the gender norm in order to destabilize your stress about me being Black. And so the other women on the board, the other white women on the board, they didn't even talk to those women. They didn't like them at all. They viewed them as too feminist to kind of negotiate with. But Claudia Hampton wasn't too feminist to them because she cooked dinner for them. She made them feel comfortable, just enough so that she could get the things she needed to give to her community. So sly civility is a resistance strategy, but it's not one of those kind of in-your-face resistance strategies. It's a very strategic resistance strategy.
Absolutely. Very, very interesting one. And as you explained this, one of the things that is coming to mind reading the book was how, like in the past, affirmative actions were always like met with this kind of intense opposition. And so just listening to how Claudia leveraged her sly civility approach to get them to trust her to be able to get to where she is very key. But what would you say are some of the very key or significant challenges that she faced amidst trying to even leverage that approach? Were there any roadblocks? Were there any challenges? I want you to speak to that and help us better understand.
Yeah, so the first thing you need to understand is that affirmative action came to the United States via an executive order. It was not a a constitutional amendment. So that meant it was kind of on shaky ground to begin with, right? And so in 65, President Johnson enacted affirmative action. And then 2 years later, women were added to the legislation. But for almost 8 years, it languished because most colleges and universities said, well, we have a non-discrimination policy. We don't need affirmative action. The two things are not the same. Non-discrimination says that you can't bar someone because of their race, their gender, their national origin, their religion. Affirmative action says you're going to take demonstrative steps to go out and recruit those people because they have a race or gender that we don't typically see in the university. So to sidestep the issue, most universities said, well, we don't bar anybody. Yeah, but you don't go out and actively recruit any either. And so part of the problem was that you needed federal mandates to scare universities into implementing affirmative action by the threat of saying, we're not going to give you financial aid access, or we're going to take away your grants or your funding. So there was already kind of federal problems, because in 1974, there was a case called DeFundis versus Oglen, and that was the first test of affirmative action. That case lost at the Supreme Court on a technicality. So what that case was supposed to do was to try to get rid of affirmative action. Only by a technicality did affirmative action stay in place. 4 years later, we have the Bakke decision. The Bakke decision is the decision that says that we are going to get rid of racial quotas, and we're going to only have race as a factor or gender as a factor in admission, not the factor. So it limited the scope. So already we got federal, and a lot of these cases were brought by people in Congress. So that was already some of the opposition that she was going to have to deal with, were this limiting and narrowing the scope of affirmative action. On top of that, in the state, you have governors who don't want to enact affirmative action. Ronald Reagan being chief amongst them. He got angry about the students in San Francisco that did the student strikes in 1968-69 to establish the first Black Studies program, and then consequently Chicano studies and Asian American studies and so forth. And so he cut the budget for the equal opportunity programs. He slashed their budgets. The reason why we have on the Cal State campuses, why we have the extended ed or CPACE or professional, the for-profit side of the university, is because Ronald Reagan slashed the budgets to EOP. And the university had to figure out a way to keep funding these programs, these pre-college programs, to help students of color and low-income students get into the university. So amid all of that backdrop, you have governors that don't want to enforce the law. You have the feds that don't want to enforce the law. And so you have to figure out some kind of way. It's really about implementation of the law. Writing a law is easy. Implementing it is a whole nother matter. And Hampton shepherded a lot of the implementation by joining forces with different people, whether it was other trustees, whether she would work with other legislators. You get some of the first Black legislators in California, Willie Brown. You have, what was his name? Mervyn Dimely. All of those folks, she started to build relationships with people at multiple levels of government. That's how she was successful. But there was a fight every single time. I think I was just mentioning to Robbie that there was a case where the Anti-Defamation League was against affirmative action. And the reason they said they were against it is because they wanted to protect the will of the white majority. This is the language that they're using at this time. Eventually they say, oh yeah, affirmative action actually is an okay thing. Affirmative action doesn't take anything away from a white person. Let me be clear. Affirmative action is about recruitment of people to diversify the institution. It does not say, it has never said, we are going to take this unqualified person who doesn't meet the minimum standards and put them in place of a qualified white person. This is why these talks about DEI and affirmative action are so frustrating, because everyone keeps parroting the same talking points that don't bear out in terms of what the law actually does. It is very limited. Affirmative action only says that we can recruit, meaning we can go into a Black church and say we're going to do some recruitment. We might do some on-the-spot admission counseling at a Black church. That's what affirmative action does. That doesn't preclude anybody else from getting in. And then low-income students are part of affirmative action, and that cuts across race. But the way we talk about, we've racialized affirmative action in such a way where it's only a narrow bit of people are, people are losing out because somebody else is gaining. That's not the way the thing works. So Hampton has to deal with all of this federal federal resistance, state resistance, even resistance within some of the Cal states.
Thank you very much. And listening to this and also trying to wrap my head around currently everything that is ongoing, with given today's legal and political landscape as it relates to affirmative action, the policies, the things that are being changed or the potentiality of things being changed with our current states, our current legal and political landscape. I guess my one thing I want you to help me better understand as I read the book was, are there any strategies that you think Hampton's advocacy currently or would be still relevant to leaders or educators who are fighting for equity today? Because in the news, on the radio, in reading on social media and everything, there's a lot to take in. So how can we mirror those two, or how can we tap into the uniqueness of what Hampton did, and it can help education or institutions be at ease when it comes to all these DEI and things ongoing?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because, in California, we got rid of affirmative action in 1996. So every time someone argues about, affirmative action, and it's like, we got rid of it with Proposition 209 in 1996. We haven't had it for over, 30 years, right? But what universities have had to do is be a bit more strategic about how they go out and recruit, and you really use the pre-college programs. EOP, the Equal Opportunity Program, has been around since the 1960s. That has been probably the most effective vehicle for helping low-income students, women, and students of color get into and get prepared for the university. But in terms of the current moment, there are things that we can do. One, the affirmative action case that came from Harvard in 2023 only deals with admission. It does not deal with anything else. So you could have affirmative action in hiring faculty, right? You could have affirmative action in terms of staff hiring. You could, because their scope was just on admission into the university. The other thing is that we could use community foundations as the way in which to, if you want to earmark scholarships for particular communities, you can do that. Like the Orange County Community Foundation, for example, has a Hispanic Scholarship Fund. They have a Black Excellence Fund, and they earmark that fund for any student, the Hispanic Scholarship Fund, particularly if a student goes to school in UC Irvine, or they go to Cal State Fullerton, which is in Orange County, they can apply for those scholarships, and they don't have to deal with the repercussions of Proposition 209. And you have some universities that, like Cal State, Sacramento State, they have the new designation for a Black serving institution. It doesn't mean they're going to get any federal funding or any state funding. It's just to tell people, and they don't even have the majority of Black students in the Cal State system. What they have is a track record of services to support Black students. And that's all the designation does. So there are vehicles by which we can kind of circumnavigate a lot of this stuff. The other thing too, you know, and this is just my personal opinion on this, we spend a lot of our time responding to a lot of time to federal mandates and to state mandates, but a lot of what needs to happen is culture shifts in our campus before it even gets to that point. What I mean by that is if your leaders on your campus, if it's your presidents, your deans, and so forth, don't authentically support diversity in and of itself as a value, it gets reflected in the kind of programming they support and the policies they support, with or without, you know, having been told by the federal government to kind of crack down on things. So, and then we have institutional cultures that we have to shift. You know, a lot of times, I'm just thinking of a particular example at Cal State Dominguez. I was a faculty advocate for the CARES team, which works with students who are in crisis. And I said, this was the first time they'd ever had a faculty member on. It was always staff. And I said, you know, a lot of these incidents are students having conflict with faculty, and the faculty are using language like, oh, I felt threatened by the student. And it comes off as, oh, the students are violent, or the students, and it's racialized.
Aggressive.
Yeah, they're aggressive. And it's like, maybe you're interpreting intensity for hostility. You know, so maybe we need to do some culture shifting, because how some students communicate their stress isn't that they are going to try to run up on you and beat you up. It's they want you to understand, take me seriously. So those things we can do without a federal mandate. Those are the kind of changes, the culture shifts that we need to change. How we talk about our Latinx students, how we talk about our Asian students. I think we essentialize our students into one group, and we don't think about how you got to respond to students in a different way. Students are not the same way as when I was in undergrad. That's, you know, they're just not. I'm old. I communicate differently. I don't use my full body when I'm talking to people. You know, that young Gen Z, you're more expressive in terms of using your full body. And I had to accept that as a faculty member. Like, they're not going to talk to me the same way. And I have to explain to them, like, okay, this is acceptable and this is not, you know, and I can do the thing with you too. You know, I can make the face and turn my head and do all the things.
I like that. It's very important for us to, you know that you don't. Sometimes I feel like there's a lot of generalization and there's a lot of tagging, because, hey, even if we're in the mix of, 10 Latinx students or 10 Black students or 10 Asian students, everyone is individual and would be different, right? And so I like how you put it together and how you kind of draw the line of, or the comparison of even you being a faculty and how you're able to relate to, your students and things like that. And so now I want to bring it home. Reading your book, I realized how very passionate you were in writing the book, or writing about Dr. Hampton. And I guess, I feel like the book is timely, if I should put it that way. It's timely, it's much needed. You drew a lot of attention on Dr. Hampton and how everything played together with her role. However, what actually inspired you to write the book, and what discoveries did you find during the research that you did? I want you to help us connect the dots, because of course she might have been very pivotal in helping with whatever structure she put in place, a reason why you ended up getting a seat at the table. But really, what was the inspiration?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for those not familiar with the trustees, and most people in the Cal State system don't understand the trustees at all. So maybe it's important to kind of go back there first. The trustees are supposed to be the people who have oversight over the entire system, all 23 campuses, whether that's the finances, whether that is hiring, particularly presidents of campuses, chancellors, but they have incredible power but we don't pay attention to who they are. They're appointed by governors, so therein lies some concern that I've always had, like how close are they to politicians who appoint them? Is this like a political patronage type of thing? But they can, if there is a campus newspaper, for example, that posts the op-ed that they find objectionable, they can pull funding from that campus. They have that much power. They don't often exercise it because they got a whole system to deal with, but they can. And before Hampton came on board, the trustees didn't care about curriculum or they really did. They could care less about educational policy. They left that to the faculty. But after the 68 student strike in San Francisco State, they got more and more involved in the day-to-day operations of the university. For those of you who are faculty who have been through program review, you know, where your programs are evaluated every 5 to 7 years, that came about as a reaction to what happened in San Francisco State. They were, at first, the university was only targeting Black studies for program review. And then they said, yeah, that might look a little racist. So let's go ahead and have program review for all programs on this kind of rotating basis. So the trustees have a lot of power. They can dictate whether your tuition goes up. They can dictate whether the admission standards change to get into the university. And the reason why I was so passionate about talking about Claudia Hampton, one, we don't know anything about most trustees. Trustees are hidden. My book, from what I understand, is the first book that actually talks about the race and gender contours of trusteeship. Most books on trustees talk about how to be a good trustee is to be a good listener, you know, and to read all of the policy, but they don't talk about the nuances of racism and sexism. That's one thing. The second reason I was very passionate about writing this book is to understand the system that I was a part of. Like, am I helping to serve the goals of the system or not? The Cal State system it's older than the UCs. So the UCs were created in the 1880s. The Cal State system was created in 1852 at San Jose State. We are a teaching-based institution. That is we're supposed to prioritize being good teachers. But then when I was going through the ranks to become a tenured professor, there was this high emphasis on research. And I was like, well, why are we doing all this research if our
main focus
is
is
teaching?
Mm-hmm.
What you discover is that because folks in the California legislature were giving more money to the UCs because they were doing research and kind of starving the Cal State system, a lot of Cal States decided we better put research on our requirements for faculty so that we could be seen as legitimate scholars like those at the University of California. Nowhere in our collective bargaining agreement says that we're required to do research. The requirement is we're supposed to do 15 units every semester, 3 units of advising or service, and the rest is supposed to be teaching. So I needed to understand that, like, why were we emphasizing this research, and why were we getting paid so much less than either the community colleges or the University of California? Because it was like we had this kind of stepchild mentality, like we didn't fit. So I wanted to understand all of those things as I started to move into the second iteration of my career as an administrator. I needed to understand the context and trying to make sense of such a mammoth system. I mean, the system is huge. We graduate 500,000 students per year, and all the campuses are different. We have a lot of policies that are similar, but there's a lot of differences. And I always felt like the Cal States were getting the short end of the stick in terms of funding. And then I figured out that the University of California is written into the California Constitution as a public trust, which means that they get funding without all the oversight. We, on the other hand, in the Cal State system, get all the oversight and none of the money, because we are we were created for the purpose of teaching. So we report to not only the legislature, but also the Board of Education. And so all of those rules impact us. And so why you see a lot of bureaucratic red tape in the Cal State system is kind of how we were founded. So the historian in me needed context. I needed context to understand how my job as a department chair when I was at Dominguez Hills was impacted. Like, why don't we have enough money to do the things that we need to do? Well, we got to go beg the legislature for funding. And if the legislature thinks that what we're doing is not good enough or on par with the UCs, that's part of the problem.
So just a follow-up, do you think that whilst you were writing the book and leveraging, you know, the historian in you doing the research, did you uncover any key, you know, figures within the system or the CSU system, or even on a broader scale, like the educational circles where, you know, individuals like Hampton themselves played a key pivotal role in advancing some of this equity alongside Hampton?
Yeah, we actually had a woman chancellor by the name of Ann Reynolds. Ann Reynolds was chancellor in the CSU from 1982 to 1990.
Okay.
She was a polarizing figure. I will be honest about that. Some people hated her style, but there was no one more committed besides Claudia Hampton to making sure that women and students of color had the best opportunities in the Cal State system. She created the Hispanic Underrepresentation Committee, which grew the number of Hispanic Latino faculty, staff, and students by 30% in that time period. She was responsible for expanding partnerships between LA Unified and San Francisco Unified, so there would be a pipeline for students graduating from those schools to get into the Cal States. She created the doctoral fellowship program where if you it's a forgivable loan. And not Claudia Hampton, but Ann Reynolds was the brainchild behind it. She couldn't have gotten anything passed though without Claudia Hampton. Claudia Hampton was the person that everybody loved. And so Ann Reynolds, like I said, polarizing figure, have these great ideas for expanding opportunities for students. And then she would turn to Claudia like, okay, I need you to go run interference work. So you had people in the system who were committed, and there's been regular intervals on all the campuses where people have done, tried to move the needle, to use the euphemism, to improve access and equity. But what often happens is after a few years, you find that the money disappears, whether the legislature cuts back or we redistribute the priorities. And so you needed someone like Hampton, who served on the board for 20 years, to be constantly on folks to make sure they lived up to their promise. And while she was on the board and while Reynolds was the chancellor, you had the greatest increase in the number of students of color and faculty of color in terms of increase. It has not been duplicated since. And after Proposition 209, it's regressed for a lot of communities.
So reading your book, one of the key things that I also got was, themes that I also got was, you know, you highlighted a lot of leadership and also a lot of, you know, representation, right? And just reading how Dr. Hampton's leadership style did reflect, you know, the powerful examples of how Black women had navigated institutional spaces whilst they're trying to drive change and implement change. I guess one of the things that came to mind that I would like you to speak to would be, you know, when it comes to insights from her journey, you know, do you think that most valuable Black women seeking leadership today, what would be a good thing for them to tap in, or what are some of the insights that they can tap in or draw from her as it relates to representation? Because I know, even not here in the California, you know, system, but personally, I have female Black friends who are into academia, who are in other states, in other state schools or institutions. And so it would be interesting to see what you have to say about that.
Yeah, so Dr. Hampton really relied, so to begin, before she got to the trustees, she was an elementary school teacher in Chicago Public Schools, and then she came to Los Angeles. And she ended up, after the Watts riots of 65, she ended up becoming the director of an office called the Office for Schools and Community Relations. She was responsible to triage any race flare-ups between principals at schools, usually white principals and Black and brown parent groups, like the PTAs and stuff. So she had a lot of experience in kind of working with the public, working with the NAACP, working with other organizations. She also was very active in the Los Angeles community in terms of her church, her sorority. She was on the board. She was on the board for the YMCA. She created her own political action committee that helped elect Tom Bradley to mayor of Los Angeles. So I would say that for Black women who are looking for leadership, the first place is to start is close to home. Start in your community. Like, start with the organizations, start in church if that's where you feel comfortable to kind of learn how to model that type of leadership. So I'll just use myself as an example. My grandmother was one of the creators of an organization called the Office for Black Community Development. After the Watts riots, we didn't have any grocery stores in our neighborhood. And so we're like, well, where do we go for groceries? There's nothing, everything's been burnt down, basically. And so my grandmother got a grant from Jerry Brown when he was governor the first time around to create a Black supermarket training program. And they created a food co-op right across the street from the Imperial Courts projects, not far from where I grew up in Compton Watts area. And so I was a little kid, and they used to make me go knock on the doors of everybody in the projects and do an elevator pitch, join the food co-op. And so here I am, probably 6 or 7 years old when this is happening, and I'm learning leadership as a very young child. And that gradually kind of molds and shapes my leadership style. And so what I take from Hampton is similar to what my grandmother gave to me, is to find something in your community that is near and dear to you and jump in and get involved and learn. And there's a type of leadership style called developmental leadership. And Black women practice this a lot. We don't need formal training to get things done. We just get in there and say, the community needs this, let's go do it. And so we'll figure it out as we do it. But we will get other women involved with us. Like, okay, look, that street light over there that, that keeps going out and the kids keep getting near miss hit. I'm thinking of a specific example. The ladies in my neighborhood walked around the corner to this substation where it was like a community substation and demanded that the city fix the light. And they used just that one act of protecting their children to roll into creating this food co-op. So you can start with something small and build out from there. But the way in which they did it was as a collective. Because if you go by yourself, you run the risk of people, targeting you. So if you go as a group, imagine a group of Black mamas coming in all together, you're like, yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and give them what they need. But if it's one person, it's like, I don't know.
Right. I like how you put this and explain this. And one of the things I want to highlight is reading the book, I also realized how Dr. Hampton, she was an educator herself. You even mentioned how she was a kindergarten teacher from Chicago and then she moved here. And so it's key for us all to understand how education plays a significant role in our lives and how it's important to, hold education near and dear to our heart. Personally, I am a retired professor's daughter, so I grew up on a university campus. Sometimes I tell my story and I tell people that for me, growing up, I knew education was not going to be non-negotiable because of my dad and growing up on a university campus. But listening to key women in the education trajectory and how even just the mere fact of she teaching in an elementary, it could not be elementary, you know, you could be here and you're helping your youth in church. You could be here and you're teaching the children's, you know, Sunday school class and things like that. And so just finding what is going to help you develop or what is going to help you do that service would be very significant. And so tying it in and understanding how passionate she was about education, I think, you know, just to put a bow on this whole leadership and also representation focus, I just want to find out, you know, how do you think her teaching background informed her approach or the policy making or even the advocacy she did? I know you've touched on it here and there, but just maybe in 1 or 2 sentences, how do you think the teaching background she had kind of influenced some of these policy and advocacy?
Yeah, because she mostly worked with English language learners in East Los Angeles and also low-income students throughout Los Angeles County when she moved into the administrative role in LA Unified. I think she had a special sensitivity to these students needing an advocate. That she knew that there were other people on the board who they could not relate to these students whatsoever, but she could. And so she accepted the responsibility of being the affirmative action trustee. She calls herself that. She's like, yeah, I'm the affirmative action trustee. Yeah. And so instead of trying to shy away from it, like, you know, how people are like, oh, don't call me DEI, you know, that sort of thing. She embraced it. Like, I'm here for that purpose. But I'm not only here for that purpose. I'm here to help change attitudes. But in order to do that, I have to advocate for these kids.
And you know, when we talk of affirmative action, or she calling herself the affirmative action trustee, you know, on a very broad impact, she did a lot of contributions, which I really admire how you are able to capture it in the book, because it's one thing knowing of somebody, and it's another thing knowing the person and writing about what she did and helping people really understand what she actually did to impact a very, you know, broad generational, broad scope of individuals. And so her contribution, I always see to be very influential. Her contribution reading your book, I see as something that was worth writing about, honestly. I think I cannot stress on this enough, the fact that with everything that is happening now in our world, when it comes to whether it's the legal side or even the political side of things in our education systems, it's key for us to be reading some of these things. And for me to even hear today that, you know, there's a lot of trustee books that have been written, but one that really talks about affirmative action and really ties in the knots or crosses the T's, dots the I's in it. I think this is the first book, like you're saying, and we really appreciate you writing that book. My final question, and then I'll throw it out to our amazing audience, would be, you know, in what ways do you think or believe that Dr. Hampton's work actually helped shape national conversations around affirmative action and also just, you know, equity in higher education?
Yeah, so she's had more than just a state influence. She was actually appointed by Reagan when he became president to a federal post on financing education. So she influenced policy at the federal level as well.
Okay.
So her impact, I think, is quite broad. I would say that the most important thing in terms of her contribution is that, you know, your work does not end simply because you got to the first leg of the journey, and that you have to be willing to enlist people who might not agree with you. I think that was what I took away from it a lot, because she was negotiating with Republicans and people of all political stripes. There is a scholarship in the CSU system to this day named in her honor, the Claudia Hampton Memorial Scholarship. Fortunately, she lived to see that come to fruition. But the person who put together the seed money was a staunch Republican. He loved Claudia Hampton. His wife told him to do it. And he put the seed money, and then the Cal State system used some of the lottery funds to do matching. And it's been around for over 30 years. So students who, particularly out of LA Unified, but I think it's across the state, you can go to any of the Cal States and you would get this funding. That's how much of an impact this woman had. And yet, because she's a trustee, we didn't know much about her. How many of you who are students have received or ever received a state university grant? Anybody? Okay, that's Claudia Hampton. The reason why you have a state university grant is because Claudia Hampton advocated for students, because at the time, this was sometime in the early 90s, there was budget cuts and they were going to increase student tuition. And she said, well, if you're going to increase student tuition, you need to offset that with more need-based financial aid for students. Because she was always attentive to the fact that not everybody could afford a college education, but there were promising students who could do well. So I received a state university grant. That's how I got my master's degree from Cal State Long Beach. And we had a few people in the audience. You're a direct beneficiary of her advocacy. The reason why we have many of the changes to the admission policy, where there would be protections to make sure that students of color or students from low income backgrounds or from urban areas got in, she put in those protections. So a lot of stuff we don't know until we go into the archive and find out. Now, that was really the joy of writing the book, was just looking at how expansive her impact was. One thing she did, what seems so simple, is nobody else cared about the rules committee. It was like one of them throwaway committees. We'll just put you on that committee. Well, she went and read the rules inside and out and then said, hey, before we hire another chancellor, we need to get a rule that says presidents are going to be held responsible for the implementation of affirmative action. Because too often we have some paper pusher, and that's not to demonize people who work in affirmative action, but we put this middle person responsible for affirmative action, but you need leadership in charge to be held accountable. And so that, to this day, there is a provision in the policy that says for all affirmative action or diversity related goals, the person who's ultimately responsible is the campus president. So she did a lot to put structural things in place to make sure the Cal States stayed true to its mission.
Absolutely. So thank you so much, Dr. Nicol. For me, my greatest key takeaway reading, the book and even having this conversation with you has been just, ultimately, if you're here, you're a student or you're a faculty member, you're online watching or listening to us, build relationships, right? Build relationships. That way you would be able to gain access to, whatever network or community you find yourself in. And through that, you can make an influence and a positive impact. So if not for anything that you got through this conversation, I am strongly urging you to build relationships and connections wherever you find yourself. It doesn't have to be at the top, or it doesn't have to be, in a very fancy setting or anything like that. Just as Dr. Nicol said, it can even start from your community, from your church, where you find yourself comfortable. And then I believe strongly that through that, you can gain the necessary action or access that you need to be able to make a change or make a difference. And so with that, before I have you give us maybe some final words, I want to throw the question to the audience. Are there any key questions or anything that is top of mind that, based on what you've heard today, you want Dr. Nicol to throw more light on or share one or two with? Yes, sir.
Mhm.
Yes, thanks for the question. So Reagan was governor up until 74, and he was getting ready to leave, well, 76, sorry. He was getting ready to leave office. Well, kind of on the cusp of leaving office. But his education secretary, a man by the name of Alex Sheriffs, used to have this regular practice of inviting people to his office to come in and talk about education issues. Top of, during that period, it was always busing and, anything related to civil rights. So he invited the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He invited their representative, a woman by the name of Verna Canson, to come and talk to him for 30 minutes. Verna Canson's career is in banking, and she was like, I should not do this. So she called around and got branch presidents to come to this meeting with her up in Sacramento. Well, the branch president for the LA chapter could not attend. He sent Claudia Hampton. He said, you work in education. It makes the most sense you go up there. And so out of that, instead of one person showing up, 12 people showed up. And the man was kind of overwhelmed by the sheer numbers, and the conversation went on for hours. And what ended up happening after that was 12 got whittled down to one person over the course of a year. So he would have people meet him at different places from that 12, and he would like kind of gauge their politics. And the last person standing was Claudia Hampton. He got appointed as the vice chancellor of academic affairs for the Cal State system, and he wanted a friendly face on the board. And so he asked Reagan to appoint Claudia Hampton. Claudia Hampton was a Democrat, not a Republican. She did not do any campaign contributions to Reagan. Most of the people who he appointed were folks who had given, campaign contributions. And in fact, he gave Claudia Hampton the 8-year appointment. That's a typical appointment for a trustee. And there was another woman by the name of Yvonne Larson from San Diego, philanthropist, husband, gave a bunch of money to Ronald Reagan, but Reagan only gave her the 1-year appointment, and San Diego were pissed off about it. Like, what you giving this black woman this 8-year appointment and giving a white woman 1, right? But it was as a favor to Alex Sheriffs. That's how she got appointed. But they vetted her for over a year to make sure her politics weren't too radical in it. To really check her politics. Like, what would you do here in this racial flare-up? What would you do over here? How would you do this? And they would crisscross the state, checking these folks' politics. So it wasn't that Reagan wanted her necessarily. He only met her once. He did it as a favor to someone else. But she took advantage of the appointment in terms of trying to be effective. For her first year, she didn't talk. She says it in the audio that I found. She said, I didn't say anything. I just learned the culture. I learned who was the power players. And then I knew I had to negotiate with them. So she would trade votes with the influential men on the board, and then she would start to invite those influential men to dinner at her house. It was very, very strategic on her part because she didn't know any of them and she didn't roll in their same circles. In terms of the board, ever since then, there have been black women and black men on the board at various times. They never really would go over 2 black people at a time. For some reason, it seemed to like to be a little quota. Right now, there's currently 1 black man. There was a black woman, but she is currently filling somebody's political seat. She was an appointment. She was appointed by Gavin Newsom to fill Latifah Simon. She's filling someone's seat right now. The board composition does not reflect the student body. The student body, our student body is, 60, 70% Latinx. And, you gotta, maybe 4 or 5 people out of a board of 17 are Latinx. So the board is not reflective of the student body. And that's across the United States. you know, most of the power is kind of concentrated in the hands of these boards or their regents and stuff like that, and they don't reflect what the students, you know, the student composition is. And so one of the reasons why representation is important, it's not just to say, hey, we got a Black one or we got a Latinx one. It's so that you could build better policy. You build better policy when you have people with diverse backgrounds. So they can say, did you ever consider the financial cost of, you know, increasing tuition, for example? So like Claudia Hampton, because she worked with poor students, and by all means, she was middle-class Black. You know, she had a doctorate degree before she even got on the board. She lived in the upper-class area, Black area of View Park in Los Angeles. By all measures, she was an upper-middle-class Black person. But because she worked in the Black community in LA Unified, she could relay that in terms of policies when she got to the Cal State system. So representation isn't just a feel-good factor for anybody. It's so you can make better policy, you know. So thanks for the question.
Any other question? Yes, Rory.
I know you mentioned,
Yeah.
touch on it, you said, you know, important speaking for those with whom you may not necessarily agree. So if those particular aspects of your style and having studied likability, have you sort of adopted that in certain situations?
Yeah, I would say, and I definitely talk about it in the book. I talk about it as some lessons that I have learned. And there's one particular scenario where I had a donor come in and insult my field. So I was in Africana Studies, and oh, I'd never forget it. She came in, she had been giving money to the university for a while, and we wanted to renew this relationship so we can have scholarships and things for students. Well, she said, well, what's your research about? And I said, oh yeah, I'm writing this book on this Black woman trustee, Claudia Hampton. And before I could even finish getting it out of my mouth, and this, mind you, this is a Black woman who's saying this to me, I don't want you to assume that just because she's Black, she experienced racism. And I was like, whoa, wait, hold on. Where'd that come from? And so I said, well, she actually did. And she said, well, you know, people in your field. And I said, what are you talking about? She said, in Africana Studies. I don't even know if that's really a field. And the radical Black tradition in me was like, get her. But the pragmatist who needed to keep at the forefront of my mind that these students needed this scholarship said, you know, be a little more gentle, soften it a little bit. So I gave her the example that I talk about in the book, where one of the white male trustees yelled, excuse the language, there's a nigger in the woodpile, when he's directing this language directly to Claudia Hampton over a fight about affirmative action. And so I say there are examples of her experiencing this kind of racism. And I'm like, dang, I think I put the scholarship in jeopardy. That's all I'm stressed about. But luckily, a woman who knew Claudia Hampton was standing nearby. And I turned to her and I said, didn't you know Claudia Hampton? She said, yeah, she was my sorority sister. She, you know, I used to work with her when I was the dean of the college, and it deflected all of the attention off of me. And we got the conversation back on track and we got the money. But, you know, there was a part of me like, defend your field. Like, don't come up in here and tell me about my research. I know my research. But I had to think about, and this is one of the things that's important about sly civility to think about, it's not a sort of thing where you're just trying to enrich yourself. You're trying to help a community with your action. So you have to keep your goals at the forefront. And sometimes that requires you to like say, okay, there's a time and place to have this conversation. And so my style has changed as a result of that. You know, now I work in personnel and curriculum, so I have to negotiate, you know, because conflict resolution is part of my job. I help put out fires in departments between faculty members or between faculty and other administrators or faculty and students. So I had to adopt some of Claudia Hampton in order to be successful, to be in the position I'm in now. So yeah, she changed me more than I, initially thought possible. When I first heard her talking about making dinner for the white men on the board, I walked away from the project for 6 months. I was like, nope, can't do it, won't do it. You can't make me do it. This goes against, my feminist principles, my Black radical principle, everything that how I was raised, it seemed to go against that. And then I found the language of sly civility. And then once I could explain what she was doing, I went back to the project. So I was humbled by her. I'm not gonna lie. So yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Comments?
Mhm. 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 Yeah, I think that's a awesome question because the messaging around affirmative action is and DEI is solely on race. But if you look at, the Americans with Disabilities Act, that would fall under the purview of DEI. If you look at the, like to your point, the number of beneficiaries in terms of jobs and contracting were white women. I think that those of us who are proponents of affirmative action and DEI need to figure out a way to explain these things that don't, I'm not gonna say raise alarm bells, but we have to stop being so damn intellectual about it and just make it really practical. So let me give you a practical example. When I'm talking about how affirmative action negatively impacts a community, if you look at Los Angeles County, before affirmative action was obliterated in California, African Americans received 15% of all government contracts. 2 years later, after affirmative action was gone, African Americans to this day only represent 0.23% of all government contracts. When you say it like that, when you say that affirmative action, the loss of affirmative action has had a crippling effect on people being able to grow businesses, that sounds better than the kind of moralistic why you should do affirmative action in DEI. Similarly, when we talk about white women as beneficiaries to affirmative action, oftentimes we don't present those numbers when we're having those conversations. We just say it. And then somebody will say, well, you just are, you're upset and this is to deflect. Well, if you show the hard numbers, then it's hard for them to say this is a deflection. Same with welfare beneficiaries. The largest, like raw numbers of beneficiaries are white women. But when we say it, what's happening is we're saying it after the fact instead of kind of saying it on the front end. It's always a reaction instead of being proactive. I think that, like if you look at, in the book, I talk about what happens, what were the raw numbers, or what was the raw impact of the loss of affirmative action in the Cal State system? Like, how did it impact people? So for American Indians, African Americans in particular, and certain Asian American groups, not all, the student population dropped in half, like officially cut, like just straight in half. For the Latinx population, interestingly enough, there was a drop in those numbers, but then the numbers rose. Well, the numbers rose because the population doubled. So you went from 8 million in 1996 to 15 million 20 years later. By just the sheer numbers, you are going to have greater numbers of Latinx folks. But here's the thing, the graduation rates for Latinx students has peaked at 2015, and it has not gone any higher. So we have people on campus, but we're not getting them through to the end. So there's something happening where just having the numbers is not enough. And that's what affirmative action is kind of, and DEI is kind of there for. It's like, you don't just need the numbers, you also need the programs that will help people finish. So I think that there's a messaging issue that has to, trying to tell someone, we just need to expand opportunity for everybody. That's too hollow. You need something much more concrete so people can hear like what these impacts really are. I just think that those folks who are supporters are just being too in their head about it. And I'm including myself too. Yep. Any other question?
All right. Thank you all so much for your questions. Dr. Nicol, what would be your final words for us today as we wrap up?
I think my final word would have to be two things. One, pay attention to all levels of governance in the university. It's not enough to just pay it, and this is for students. Students, you can go to the trustee meetings, you can make public comment, you can, especially don't just show up when there's a tuition increase proposed. You have a lot more power than you realize, but we abdicate that power to people who are appointed by governors, and they're not held accountable like a public official. So that's one thing. I think the second thing has to be when you're trying to navigate identity. In this case, Claudia Hampton is navigating gender and race at the same time. I think it's important to figure out, first walk into a space and be quiet. And I say this as someone who is a loudmouth, but you really need to learn the institutional culture before you start making moves. Study, this is something else that Claudia Hampton really refined. Study, and then you can make those moves. And then figure out how to negotiate with people by building relationships, figuring out where the resources are. When I was a student, like wherever there's going to be financial aid support, I'm going to find it. I was like a bloodhound trying to find where was the scholarships, where was a mentoring opportunity. One of the things that was frustrating to me as a department chair is that we had thousands of dollars in scholarships for students and they wouldn't apply. And I never could understand it. What you complaining about tuition for if you're not going to apply? It's free money. This is $1,000 scholarship and you wouldn't even do an essay? Man, I do that essay in my sleep because I wanted to make sure I took advantage of every opportunity that was available to me. And so I think Claudia Hampton really shows us, and the way that I wrote the book, let me point this out. For the first two chapters, it's historical context. The second two chapters is, it looks like a manual. Like I say, strategy, finesse, process, obstacles is one of the strategies. Or another strategy is to I called it work with the women and manage the men. But it was a strategy she used with Ann Reynolds, because Ann Reynolds would always fight with the men. And so Hampton would manage the men. She would work with the women to get things done. To build soft power, build soft capital is that relationship building. And then chapter 4 of the book goes into how she enacted that power. People deferred to her because she cooked dinner for them. Like, that sounds crazy to us now, but the power of sitting across the table and breaking bread with someone is a really important skill to have. So I would encourage everyone, whether you're a faculty, staff, student, administrator, or anyone in between, to really, one, get to know the lay of the land of your institution. Take advantage of all the resources and opportunities that they have available. And then to really try to stand up for yourself and advocate for yourself when it comes to going to trustee meetings, meetings on your campus, to the ASI meetings, all of those sort of things. We're not powerless. We're probably power ignorant, or information ignorant is more of what's happening. And I think the Cal State system is an incredible resource, but I don't think it's living up to its full potential, and it can.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Nicol. Can we give a round of applause to Dr. Nicol? Thank you for your time. Thank you for your book. Thank you for sharing your experience and your knowledge. This has been very, very helpful. And on behalf of the students here, the faculty here, on behalf of the library organizers and folks online, we want to say thank you. We really appreciate this event and you availing yourself. And we wish you safe travels back to where you came from. Thank you.